The wind was brutal, but not as brutal as the look Ryan gave her when he opened that massive wooden door. Snow clung to Aaliyah's braids, melting into the torn seams of the only dress she owned, a washed-out green thing that looked more like a memory than clothing. Her boots were soaked, her fingers stiff, her breath trembling in the frozen air of a wealthy white man's mansion she never imagined standing in front of. She didn't speak right away. She couldn't. Her lips were too cold to form words. Ryan stared at her like she didn't belong on his porch, or in his world, or even in this weather. His voice came out low and sharp. "Why would you come here dressed like that? It's below zero." Aaliyah swallowed hard, eyes glistening but defiant. "It's all I have." That silence after her answer hurt more than the cold. If this already made your blood boil, tap like, and subscribe so you don't miss stories where justice finally wins. Snow hissed across the steps. Ryan's hand tightened on the door as if he was about to shut it in her face. She braced herself for the impact, rejection she'd already lived through too many times. Then soft footsteps. A small boy peeked around Ryan's leg. 7 years old, big brown eyes, pajamas with little rockets printed on them. "Nate, Daddy, who is she?" Ryan didn't answer. Nate did something his father didn't expect. He stepped closer, a little closer, until he was standing right in front of this freezing stranger in torn clothes. His tiny hand reached for hers. "She's cold. She shouldn't stay outside." Aaliyah blinked. No one had touched her hand gently in months. Nate turned to his father, eyes pleading. "Can she come in? Please." Ryan's jaw tightened. Something inside him wrestled. Caution, grief, pride, fear of what the town would say. But behind all that, a flicker of the man he used to be. He stepped back. One night, just one, Aaliyah walked inside, and the warmth hit her so fast her knees almost buckled. She held her posture, refusing to look overwhelmed by the polished floors, the towering staircase, the smell of cinnamon still hanging in the air from a life she wasn't part of. Nate tugged her hand gently, guiding her toward the fireplace as if she had always belonged there. Ryan watched every step she took, confused, conflicted, and trying hard not to feel anything at all. The storm outside roared louder, but inside the house something else sparked to life. Something small, warm, and dangerous to a man who'd sworn never to let anybody close again. Aaliyah sat near the fireplace, palms open toward the flames, trying to get the feeling back into her fingertips. The warmth crawled up her arms, like it wasn't sure it was allowed to touch her. Her dress steamed where the snow had melted into the worn fabric. Nate sat beside her on the rug, legs crossed, clutching his wooden toy car. He kept sneaking glances at her, fascinated the same way a child watches a story being told without any words. Ryan leaned against the doorway, arms crossed tightly across his chest. He wasn't looking at the fire. He was watching her, watching the way she held herself like she expected to be pushed away at any moment. Aaliyah finally spoke, her voice soft enough that the crackle of the fire almost swallowed it. "I didn't plan to end up here. I left someone behind, something behind, but I couldn't stay. Not after what happened." Ryan's gaze sharpened. "What happened?" Aaliyah looked down at her hands. The bruises along her knuckles weren't fully healed. Her breath trembled for a split second, then steadied. "Some places you leave because you want to," she whispered. "Others you leave because you're not sure you'll survive if you stay." She didn't explain further. She didn't have to. The mystery wrapped around her like the very cold she had escaped. If this happened right in front of you, what would you do? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. And if you stand for fairness, hit subscribe. Nate shifted closer, his little voice barely above a whisper. "Are you scared?" Aaliyah smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried years of pretending everything was okay. "I've been scared before," she said. "Tonight, I'm just tired." Nate nodded like he understood perfectly, even though he shouldn't have. Kids who grow up around grief learn to read sadness like adults read books. Ryan took a slow breath, wrestling with what to say next. "You can sleep in the guest room," he said finally, voice lower. "Top of the stairs. First door." Aaliyah hesitated. "Are you sure?" "It's just for tonight." His words were sharp, but something in him cracked at the edges, not weakness, but the memory of someone he once promised to protect. Nate tugged Aaliyah's sleeve gently. "Don't worry. Daddy pretends to be mean when he's scared." Ryan shot him a look, but Aaliyah actually smiled, small, tired, real. "Thank you," she said quietly. She stood, moving slowly so her legs wouldn't give out. As she climbed the stairs, the wooden steps creaked beneath her, each sound echoing her exhaustion. Ryan watched until she disappeared around the corner. He didn't trust her story, but something told him she wasn't lying, and something deeper told him she hadn't told even half of it. Morning drifted into the house slowly, like even the sun wasn't sure it was welcome. Aaliyah stepped into the kitchen quietly, unsure she was supposed to be there at all. Her dress was finally dry, though still wrinkled from being washed by hand in the guest room sink. She brushed her braids back, trying to look composed even though her stomach twisted from nerves and hunger she hadn't admitted out loud. Nate was already on a stool, kicking his legs, watching the snow outside. "Miss Aaliyah," he said, as if she were someone he'd been waiting for. "Daddy said you can sit. I saved you a seat." Aaliyah smiled, a small, cautious thing, and sat at the edge of the table. Ryan stood near the counter, pouring coffee. He looked rested in the way only rich men ever do, but his eyes flicked toward her with something like uncertainty. "You can't help yourself," he said stiffly, gesturing toward the stove. "I made oatmeal. It wasn't fancy, but to someone who had been eating scraps for days, it looked like a feast." Aaliyah hesitated, waiting. Ryan rolled his eyes slightly. "It's food. Eat." She nodded and took a small spoonful. Warm, soft, gentle in her throat. For a moment, it almost undid her. Nate leaned in, whispering loudly, "Daddy forgot the cinnamon again." Ryan shot him a look. Aaliyah coughed a laugh. "I can make something later," she offered quietly, "if that's okay." Ryan didn't answer right away. He studied her hands, steady, careful, hands that didn't look like they had ever asked for help. "We'll see," he finally said. After breakfast, Nate ran to the living room to build a fort out of couch cushions. Aaliyah instinctively started clearing the table, her movements practiced and polite. The habits of someone who had worked in too many places where people judged her before they knew her. "You don't have to do that," Ryan said, leaning against the doorway. She kept wiping. "I know, but I can't sit still. It makes me feel in the way." Ryan's posture softened, just slightly. "You're not in the way." Aaliyah stopped. It was the first kind thing he'd said directly to her. Nate yelled from the living room, "Miss Aaliyah, come see my fort." She glanced at Ryan. He nodded once. And for the first time since she'd arrived, she didn't feel like a guest. She felt needed. Aaliyah found Nate sitting on the floor surrounded by broken crayons, a half-torn coloring book, and a wooden toy car with one wheel missing. He held the car in his small hands like it was something precious he couldn't replace. When he noticed her in the doorway, his eyes lit up. "Miss Aaliyah, it broke." He held it out helplessly. Aaliyah knelt beside him, taking the toy gently. The wheel had snapped clean off, not something a child could fix. But the way Nate stared, hopeful and trusting, reminded her of all the students she used to teach, the ones who believed she could fix anything. She turned the toy over, inspected the joint, felt the softness of the worn wood. "I might be able to fix it," she said softly. Nate gasped. "Really?" Aaliyah smiled, a small, confident smile she hadn't shown in days. "Let me try." She stood and went to the kitchen drawer, rummaging through until she found a tiny screwdriver and a bottle with glue. Ryan watched her quietly from across the counter, arms crossed, coffee in hand, trying not to look curious. Within minutes, she had the wheel back in place, her fingers steady and precise. She held the toy up to the light, testing it, then rolled it on the table. It moved perfectly. Nate's face exploded into joy. "You fixed it. You fixed it." Aaliyah handed it to him with a soft chuckle. "Told you I'd try." Ryan couldn't hide his surprise. "You're good with your hands," he said. Aaliyah shrugged. "I used to carve and repair things at the school. Kids break a lot when they're excited." Ryan stepped closer, studying her like he was seeing someone entirely new. "You have more skills than you let on." Aaliyah met his eyes. People notice less when you pretend you have nothing. For a second, something passed between them. Not romance, not yet, just understanding deeper than either expected. If you believe talent can silence every insult, share this video. And to everyone watching from the US, UK, and Canada, your voice matters. Nate tugged her sleeve. "Can you teach me too?" Aaliyah nodded warmly. "Of course." She showed him how to hold the toy steady, how to twist the tiny screws, how to be gentle and patient. Nate laughed when the wheel spun perfectly under his fingers. Ryan watched from the doorway, the tension in his shoulders loosening inch by inch. He hadn't seen Nate this focused since before his wife passed. He hadn't seen the house this alive since then either. Aaliyah didn't brag. She didn't boast. She didn't even look proud. She just did what needed to be done. It was a small thing, a broken toy, a fixed wheel. But Ryan understood something in that moment. This woman, the one he almost left outside in the snow, carried quiet strength in places most people never looked. And for the first time since she arrived, he wanted to know more. The storm had calmed, but the town had not. Aaliyah stepped out that afternoon to buy a few things Ryan needed. She pulled her frayed coat tighter around her shoulders as she walked toward the small general store. The snow crunched under her boots, every step sounding louder than it should, like the whole town was listening. And it was... A bell chimed as she pushed open the door. Inside, people turned. Not all of them turned away fast enough. A woman in a thick red coat whispered to the man next to her, "Isn't that the girl Ryan brought home? On Christmas Eve of all days." The man didn't whisper back. "Looks like trouble to me." Aaliyah kept her eyes forward. She grabbed bread, milk, a pack of cinnamon, because Nate had giggled about it at breakfast. She reached for a jar on the top shelf, stretching, balancing. A voice cut sharply through the aisle. "Well, look at that. Strays really are coming into town." Aaliyah froze. Standing behind her was Brooke, the same Brooke who used to host charity dinners Ryan's late wife attended. Perfect blonde hair, expensive boots, cold smile that never reached her eyes. Brooke stared at Aaliyah's coat. The rips, the worn seams, the little patch near the elbow. "Oh, honey, did you walk all the way from the city in that thing?" Aaliyah kept her voice steady. "I walked far enough." Brooke took a step closer, lowering her voice but not the venom. "You know, Ryan is a good man. He doesn't deserve to get taken advantage of." Aaliyah blinked slowly. "I'm not taking anything." "Oh, I know your type," Brooke said, circling her like a hawk. "Turn up at the right doorstep, looking helpless, waiting for someone wealthy to feel sorry for you." Aaliyah's jaw tightened. "I didn't ask for anything." Brooke smirked. "They never do. That's the trick, isn't it?" Aaliyah stepped back, breathing through the sting in her chest. Brooke leaned in. Her voice dropped to an icy whisper. "You don't belong in that house. You don't belong in this town." Aaliyah met her gaze, steady, unbroken. "People like you don't decide where I belong." Brooke's smile faltered. Aaliyah walked past her, placed the items on the counter, and paid with the little cash Ryan had handed her. As she stepped outside, the cold hit her again, but not as sharply as the judgment inside. When she returned to the mansion, Nate ran straight into her arms. "Miss Aaliyah, you're back." She hugged him tightly, hiding the shaking in her hands. Ryan appeared behind him. He saw the redness in her eyes. He saw the stiffness in her shoulders. He saw the truth before she said a word. "Who said something?" he asked quietly. Aaliyah shook her head. "It doesn't matter. It matters to me." But she walked past him, placing the groceries on the counter with more force than she meant to. He watched her, the quiet pain, the swallowed hurt, and something inside him cracked. This wasn't just a guest being mistreated. This was a woman the town had decided didn't deserve a chance. And Ryan realized he'd been too silent for too long. That evening, the sky dimmed early, leaving the house wrapped in a blue-gray stillness. Aaliyah helped Nate finish his puzzle by the fireplace. Though her hands still trembled for what happened at the store, she tried to hide it. She always tried to hide it. But children see more than adults ever admit. Miss Aaliyah, are you sad? Nate asked softly. She forced a small smile. Just tired, sweetheart. Before he could ask more, the doorbell rang, a sharp, unwelcome sound. Ryan opened it, and there stood Brooke, wrapped in her flawless white coat, like she was a queen of the snow. She didn't wait to be invited in. She stepped past him, eyes instantly landing on Aaliyah. "Oh, good. You're here," Brooke said, like addressing a problem instead of a person. Aaliyah straightened, her spine stiffening. Brooke crossed her arms. "I think we should talk, Ryan. Alone." Ryan didn't move. "Say what you need to say." Brooke scoffed. "Fine. I'll make it simple. She shouldn't be here. People are talking. They're saying things about you. About her. It's embarrassing." Aaliyah looked down, swallowing the ache rising in her throat. Brooke continued, her voice dripping with superiority. "And you," she pointed at Aaliyah, "are taking advantage of a grieving man. Showing up in rags? Please." Ryan's jaw tightened. "That's enough, Brooke." But she didn't stop. "I'm doing you a favor, Ryan. Women like her." Aaliyah's breath hitched. Brooke leaned forward, voice lowering like poison. "They come from nothing, so they have nothing to lose. They latch on to men with something to give." Aaliyah's chest rose sharply, fighting every instinct to stay silent, to stay small. But Ryan wasn't silent. "No," he said, stepping directly between them. "You don't get to talk about her like that." Brooke blinked, stunned. "Excuse me?" Ryan's voice was steady, cold, and firm. "You heard me. You don't get to judge someone you don't know. You don't get to walk into my home and insult the only person who's brought any warmth into it in months." Aaliyah's eyes widened, not because she needed defense, but because she never expected it. Brooke's face twisted. "You're choosing her?" Ryan didn't hesitate. "Yes." The room fell silent. Nate stood up, gripping Aaliyah's hand tightly. "She makes our house happy again," he said, voice small but brave. Brooke stared at them. The widower, the child, the girl she tried to destroy. And for the first time, she had nothing to say. "I think you should leave," Ryan said. Brooke scoffed, spun on her heel, and stormed out, slamming the door behind her. As the echo faded, the house felt different, lighter, safer, warmer. Aaliyah exhaled shakily, tears burning behind her eyes. "You didn't have to do that," she whispered. Ryan turned to her, his voice gentle in a way she'd never heard before. "Yes," he said softly, "I did." For the first time since she'd arrived, Aaliyah didn't feel like a burden. She felt protected. The night settled gently over the house, softer than any night since Aaliyah arrived. The storm had finally broken. The windows glowed with warm light. The fireplace crackled steadily, and the silence of the room felt peaceful instead of tense. Aaliyah sat on the edge of the couch, still processing everything that had happened. Nate leaned against her side, half asleep, clutching the toy car she'd fixed. His tiny breaths rose and fell in a rhythm that eased something tight in her chest. Ryan returned from locking the door, shoulders relaxed for the first time in days. He paused when he saw them. Nate curled comfortably against Aaliyah, and her hand resting protectively on his back. It was a sight he didn't know he needed until the moment he witnessed it. "You know," Ryan said quietly, moving closer, "he hasn't slept peacefully like this since before." Aaliyah looked down at Nate, brushing her fingers gently over his hair. "He's a good kid. He just needed someone to listen." Ryan swallowed, voice softer than she'd ever heard. "He needed you." Aaliyah's breath caught, but she didn't look away. "You needed someone too," she whispered. Ryan sat across from her, hands clasped loosely, the fire casting gold along the edges of his tired face. "When you showed up that night," he said slowly, "I thought it was a burden I couldn't carry. I thought letting anyone in would break me again." Aaliyah nodded, her own truth rising quietly. "I didn't come here to take anything. I came because I had nowhere left to stand." Ryan held her gaze, steady, honest. "And now, you have this place," he said, "if you want it." Aaliyah blinked, the warmth of his words almost too much after everything she'd endured. "I don't want to overstay," she whispered. "You haven't," he replied. "Not once." Nate stirred, mumbling softly, "Miss Aaliyah, don't go anywhere." She felt her heart pull tight. She hugged him closer. "I'm here," she whispered to him. "I'm not going anywhere tonight." Ryan stood slowly, offering her a hand, not out of pity, not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect. "You're safe here," he said quietly. "Both of us, we want you here." Aaliyah rose, still holding Nate's hand, as he drifted deeper into sleep. She looked at Ryan, a man who once saw her as a stranger at his door, now seeing her as something far more meaningful. The snow outside finally stopped. Inside, something finally began. And for the first time in a long time, Aaliyah believed she wasn't alone anymore.